that started. And we can go ahead. I'm just waiting to see, whoops, my co-host is another meeting, so I have a couple other things to just check on before I get started. All right. So, okay. Great. So I think everyone should be here. So we'll get started in just a sec. And
Hi, Faye. David should be joining too shortly.
Okay, great. Do you mind letting him in when he comes?
Yep.
Should we just wait for him if it's?
No, it's fine. He'll be in shortly. I'll let him in. Hi, everyone. Hi.
All right. All right, so thanks so much for joining us today as we'll be exploring King Chapel's religious revolution, taking a deep dive into the church's history in the 1780s under the early leadership of James Freeman. I think my presentation might be a little bit longer today just because there's so much rich content to cover and it's all really interesting. If you do need to leave a little early, no worries, feel free to head out when you need to. But we'll go ahead and get started. So since the church's founding in 1686, King's Chapel has held a unique position in Boston's religious landscape. So from New England's first Anglican church to America's first Unitarian Christian church, King's Chapel's community and theology have evolved alongside the growth of Boston, in many ways reflecting the beliefs and values of the people in an ever-changing city. So as we've taken a closer look at in recent weeks, during the American Revolution, Anglican ministers throughout the American colonies were put in oftentimes compromising positions during this time period as representatives of a faith so deeply interwoven with British royal authority. So we saw that many Anglican ministers left the colonies during the war, leaving their congregations without spiritual leadership. At King's Chapel in 1776, the departure of Reverend Henry Kaner, who we see on the left of our screen, within the first year of the war, paved the way for a revolution of their own within the church under the dynamic leadership of a young ordained man, James Freeman. By 1787, in many ways to the dismay of the emerging American Episcopal Church, King's Chapel had ordained James Freeman as their minister in a lay-led ceremony, becoming America's first Unitarian congregation and laying the groundwork for the emergence of the Unitarian Church in the United States. So before we get too much further into King's Chapel in the 1780s, because a decent portion of the history we're talking about deals directly with King's Chapel's revisions to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer as the basis of the church's liturgy, I do think it's important to spend a little bit of time getting a bit of a grasp on what this text is historically and how it came into creation. So when King's Chapel was established in the 1680s, it carried with it nearly 150 years of tradition within England's state church. Anglicanism, or the Church of England, emerged during the reign of King Henry VIII, who we see on the left, who, with the Act of Supremacy in 1534, declared England's religious independence from the Roman Catholic establishment. This act declared Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, which effectively broke ties with the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced as the communal liturgy to be used across all churches of England, came into being shortly after the formation of the Anglican Church. To lead his new faith, Henry VIII appointed an Archbishop to rule the Anglican Church, utilizing the prior Catholic network of bishops and parish churches as a way to organize the faith. So Thomas Cranmer, who is pictured in the center of your screen, was appointed as the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury and given the task of establishing precedents for worship in this new denomination. In 1549, so 15 years after Henry VIII declared himself the church's head, this theological and scholar, Archbishop Cranmer, drafted a centralized liturgy during the reign of King Edward VI. In England, the Book of Common Prayer made literate worshipers more active participants in their faith, as they could now access the fundamental texts of their religion that had previously been very rare and expensive. The Act of Uniformity several years later in 1552 made these services from Cranmer's prayer book the only style that could be used for public worship in England. And penalties for non-compliance ranged from fines to life imprisonment. However, the following year, Queen Mary I, a devout Roman Catholic, ascended to the English throne, and she restored Catholic worship, banned use of the prayer book, and executed supporters of the Anglican faith, including Thomas Cranmer, who was unfortunately burned at the stake during her reign. After this short but violent reign, Queen Elizabeth I, who we see on the right, who ruled from 1558 through 1603, restored use of the prayer book. The prayer book was modestly revised again in 1662, and this is the version of the text that became standard use in England and her colonies until the American Revolution. So it was during this period of time at the end of the American Revolution, so 1772, 1782, 1783, that King's Chapel's congregation returned to worship within the stone chapel after that interim we talked about in last week's conversation during the church's combined worship alongside Trinity. Without a minister, with Henry Kaner having left during the war, with this statement we see in his last entry in the church's baptismal register. The returning church vestryman and new senior warden, Thomas Bulfinch, invited 24-year-old James Freeman to lead the congregation as a lay reader, or a lay person who was licensed to preach and conduct some religious services, but not licensed to celebrate the communion or officiate marriages until they found an ordained minister. So Freeman was brought on board. So Freeman, of course, is on the right of the screen, this portrait many of you have probably seen in the parlor of the parish house. On the left, we have the minister of Trinity Church at the time, who we talked about a little bit last week. But Freeman was brought aboard to King's Chapel in September of 1782 to, quote, officiate in the capacity of reader for 6 months, and was expected to, quote, read the service twice every Sunday and also on saints' days. And he was initially paid £50 sterling, and after 6 months was officially named pastor of the church, and his salary was raised to £200 annually. Freeman was asked to preach with, quote, these alterations to the service that had been made by Reverend Parker, who was his predecessor at, I am missing some slides, I'm sorry about that, but we'll go back to looking at James Freeman. He was asked to preach with the alterations in the service as are made by Reverend Parker, which Thomas Bulfinch and the other congregants would have heard during the years at Trinity prior to his arrival, and, quote, leave the use of the Athanasian Creed at his discretion. So I think it's kind of important to be able to see all my slides because I do have some cool primary materials in here. So I'm just gonna bring up a different document. So just bear with me for a second so that we're able to view everything appropriately. So I'm just gonna download this quickly. I'm actually gonna make sure that everything is here. Actually, we can just go where we were. I think the order just got messed up. So we'll start here. We'll go back there. All right. Sorry about that, folks. All right, back to James Freeman. So as Freeman began preaching at King's Chapel, he would use that discretion initially to bring modest changes to the liturgy, even further than had been done by Reverend Parker during that time spent at Trinity. But as Freeman's personal faith continued to grow and evolve, he had begun to have doubts about one of the kind of fundamental aspects of the faith, which of course is the Trinity. So when James Freeman came to King's Chapel, he began to share his personal ideology and some of his own theological ideas with the congregation. Freeman, as a young man, held what were known as Arminian beliefs. Arminianism was a Dutch reform of Protestantism, which was in some ways related to Calvinism. And his beliefs under this included that human beings were born with freedom and reason, and that Jesus was a semi-angelic, but was not the same as God. And he also didn't believe that priests had the power to absolve people of sin, nor did sacraments. Ultimately, Freeman in later years would eventually come to the conclusion that for him personally, he did not see Jesus as divine as he moved further in his Anglican theology. Though interpretations, of course, among congregants and other clergymen have varied over the years and into current day. But from that kind of early period of Freeman's arrival at King's Chapel, the idea of the Trinity didn't sit well with him. And he discussed this with others, including his thoughts in his early sermons. And this rejection of the Trinity and the changes he made to the early liturgy at the church would eventually become a sticking point in his attempts for episcopal ordination. So a little bit about the background of James Freeman. Freeman grew up attending the sermons of Congregationalist minister Charles Chauncey, who you'll see on the right side of your screen, who was often preaching about God's benevolence and that people should be good, not just because of the threat of punishment, but in order to be happy and to live happy lives. During his time, Freeman's time at Harvard College, Freeman read many of the same Enlightenment philosophers that inspired American revolutionary thought. So people like John Locke, who is notable for believing people being born as blank slates, neither good or evil, who was a major influence to Freeman. He was also exposed to Enlightenment Christianity, which stressed the freedom and goodness of people and ethics. And he also, during this time, was reading contemporary writings of our people like the founding fathers of the United States. So people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and other prominent revolutionary thinkers like Benjamin Franklin. And all of these different writers and thinkers would influence Freeman to think beyond the accepted Anglican liturgy and opened him up to other ways of thinking about Christianity as he moved forward in his role at King's Chapel. But perhaps two of his largest influences on Freeman's ideological thought were Theophilus, Lindsay, and Samuel Clarke, who were two Anglican ministers who had developed anti-Trinitarian prayer books in 18th century England. During his time at King's Chapel, Freeman, we know, had correspondence with Theophilus Lindsay and wrote to him about theology and his struggles with the Anglican liturgy. And the changes that Freeman would make to the King's Chapel prayer book alongside the committee he worked with were modeled both after what Lindsay and Clarke had done previously in the 18th century. So Anglican ministers like Samuel Clarke, who we're looking at a portrait of here today, began the process of radically editing the Book of Common Prayer prior, as I said, in the 18th century. His works challenged Trinitarian doctrine, a predecessor to the Unitarian theology championed by James Freeman at King's Chapel. But during his career, Samuel Clarke had served as chaplain to Queen Anne and as rector of St. James Church in Piccadilly. Despite this notable career, Clarke was censured by the Church of England for views expressed in a 1712 book he wrote entitled On the Scripture Doctrine of the Trinity. Along with other Arian Anglicans, Clarke questioned the Trinity, emphasized the human capacity to do good, and believed that the Bible, if read with reason as well as faith, was a significant rule for Christian belief and practice. So although Clarke publicly agreed to denounce his work and no longer publish on anti-Trinitarian thought, he did continue secretly reforming a copy of his prayer book, which he personally altered all references to the Trinity within the text, leaving only those that were quoted directly from Scripture. In his work, Clarke only used texts which discussed God, excluding those with direct interpretations of the Trinity, including doxologies or liturgical words or actions to denote a brief act of praise in God's name. Later, James Freeman and King's Chapel would do the same in their own Book of Common Prayer, altering interpretations of the Trinity to only refer to God. And then we have Theophilus Lindsay, who's pictured here, who was an English contemporary of Freeman, who ended up putting Samuel Clarke's reforms into practice in the 1770s and paved the way for Freeman's reforms to the King's Chapel prayer book. In 1773, while visiting a friend in Lincolnshire while en route to start his own independent church in London, Lindsay first encountered a copy of Clarke's prayer book. And according to research done by Reverend Carl Scoville, Lindsay realized that Clarke's non-Trinitarian prayer book was the very model that he needed for creating his own prayer book. After adding additional reforms and more radical changes to the text, Lindsay established a congregation on London's Essex Street, founding England's first Unitarian congregation. So as I said, he ends up being a very large influence to James Freeman. Shortly after James Freeman was hired at King's Chapel, a member of Lindsay's church named William Hazlitt came to America in hopes of finding a preaching position here. As alluded to a bit earlier, Hazlitt came to Boston in search of a job, and Freeman learned of Clarke and Lindsay's prayer books from him. And Freeman expressed early praise of Hazlitt, writing, quote, "Before Hazlitt came to Boston, the Trinitarian doxology was almost universally used. That good, honest man prevailed upon several respectable ministers to omit it." And of course, James Freeman himself would become one of these ministers. So in taking his position, leading King's Chapel's congregation, James Freeman undertook a few kind of monumental tasks. One, he would work with the church wardens on revising the Book of Common Prayer, as was happening broadly within the newly emerging American Episcopal Church. But the second task would make the first all the more difficult, essentially adapting the prayer book to reconcile with Freeman's own theological beliefs. So for Freeman to continue working at King's Chapel, the prayer book would need to emphasize individual interpretations of Scripture, remove non-biblical mentions of the Trinity. Post-Revolutionary America and the transition from Anglican to Episcopal that was happening around him was the perfect opportunity and landscape to attempt to make these significant changes to King's Chapel's liturgy. So as I mentioned earlier when talking about when James Freeman was initially hired, the congregation in their essentially letter of hire to him allowed him for a measure of freedom in how he performed his services. So what we're looking at on the screen here is essentially the letter of hire from the church wardens, Thomas Bulfinch and James Ivers, to James Freeman, which is dated September 25th, 1782. And I've highlighted the section, which some of you may remember if you were here at last week's conversation, which reads, "The proprietors consent to such alterations in the service as are made by the Reverend Mr. Parker, and have the use of the creed of St. Athanasius at your discretion." So this is a creed that involves a lot of kind of references to Trinitarian thought. So he was given the freedom to admit that upon his hire. Freeman, in a letter to his father, so this is actually a copy of the Creed of St. Athanasius, because some folks are interested in seeing that last week. We can go back to that if people have other questions. But in a letter to his father, he wrote at that time, the proprietors of the chapel are very liberal in their notions. They allow me to make such alterations in the service, which at liberty I frequently use. We can scarcely be called of the Church of England. It seems to be the intention of the Episcopalians here to form an American church. And it should be noted that all the edits that were made initially to the Book of Common Prayer at King's Chapel were not solely under the control of James Freeman, and not all the changes that he proposed were approved. The process was a collaboration with other members of the church lay leadership, and changes would ultimately need to be approved by the congregation at large. Freeman noted at one point that, quote, of about 90 families of which the congregation consists, 15 only are opposed to the Reformation. And again, he was very much influenced by the work of Samuel Clarke and Theophilus Lindsay. So we had these really great established models for his work as he went to kind of undertake this very massive task. So what are some of these changes initially made by Freeman and the King's Chapel Prayer Book Committee in 1785? So in 1785, he writes in a letter of the changes initially, you will perceive that the Athanasian Creed is omitted. The Nicene Creed and the 39 Articles are also left out. The baptismal service is made almost entirely new, and the communion, burial, and other services corrected in many particulars. The Reformation is not so perfect as I would wish, but much is done, and more than I ever expected. I've also seen that the Nicene Creed wasn't officially removed from the prayer book until a bit later. So that's kind of an interesting point there, but that's a change that he initially wanted, at least during this time. James Freeman's legacy at this time in the 1780s can of course still be seen in the King's Chapel Book of Common Prayer today. The current 9th edition still has very important roots and ties based on his 1785 version, and it retains the original preface, which remains our best insight into Freeman's intent of his work in the initial text. So while King's Chapel became the first independent Unitarian church in America, King's Chapel at the time tried their best to consider themselves the first Episcopal church in Boston for a time, as they wished to be seen as kind of part of the emergence that was happening in the United States. And one thing that we see in the prayer book that's intentionally put in by Freeman and the committee when they're making those initial changes is they specifically say in the preface that, quote, the liturgy contained in this volume is such as no Christian can take offense or find his conscience wounded in repeating. So he really intended to make it kind of open and non-offensive to kind of the other members of the congregation itself who may have disagreed with some of his ideas, but also the emerging Episcopal church. But by 1785, the summer of 1785, we do see the first printing of the King's Chapel Book of Common Prayer. So here on the screen, we go from, this is a 1706 copy of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on the left side of the screen, and here is the title page from the original first printing of the 1785 King's Chapel Book of Common Prayer. But you can see here too that the language they're using at the time in the original first edition of the King's Chapel Prayer Book, they refer to themselves as the first Episcopal church in Boston, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But while amending the prayer book proved in some ways an easy effort in comparison to the massive task of securing episcopal ordination for James Freeman. During his early years as a lay reader for King's Chapel, Freeman was pretty optimistic in many ways about getting ordained. The first step in ordination would be cementing his place within King's Chapel. Freeman carried a lot of anxiety initially about the congregation's response to his theology early on, but after receiving this encouragement and kind of positive response to his early sermons, and moving forward with the prayer book, he was really finding his place and coming to his own within the church. But even after his success with revising the King's Chapel liturgy and the ongoing support from the majority of the church's membership, as well as strong support from the lay leaders at the time, of course, James Freeman at this point is still unordained 3 years after he initially arrived at the church. So practically, as I mentioned earlier, this meant that he still could not have the authority to perform certain religious rites, including weddings, funerals, certain prayers, communion. During those early years of James Freeman's lay ministership and lay readership at King's Chapel, they're relying pretty heavily on Reverend Samuel Parker at Trinity Church to kind of come over when they need to have an ordained minister for various reasons. So there's kind of this partnership at that point, and a little bit of mentorship to some extent as well. But for, as I said, for his career to continue, the leadership would have to pursue Freeman's ordination, but it would be a complicated path. They discussed several avenues of his ordination and sought out prospective candidates to perform the ceremony. So Freeman, as I mentioned a little bit earlier when talking about his initial theology, was never a supporter of the hierarchical and administrative structure within the Church of England. And he, as I said, saw the early American Republic as a time and place of opportunity to work towards adopting new structures for individual church organization. And in a letter to his father, he wrote, quote, "I like the liturgy of the Church of England, but am fond of independent form of ecclesiastical government." The first choice, or the traditional choice in looking at ordination, would be for someone like Freeman to go to England and be ordained by an Anglican bishop. So before the American Revolution, this would have been the only path for ordination for an Anglican minister. And even American-born clergy, if they were Anglican ministers in the colonies, they would have made that pilgrimage to be ordained in England. Freeman himself put that option to rest, partially, in conversation with the current events happening in the Episcopal Church at the time, but he wrote in a letter to his father as well, quote, "To go to England for them would be pleasant enough, but base and servile for a free republican." So really talking about those political tensions within the church at that time. The next logical step was to have Freeman ordained by clergymen who were themselves ordained by the Anglican Church. Two prominent individuals sought out by King's Chapel were the Bishop Samuel Seabury, who we're looking at the moment on our screen, as well as the Reverend and soon-to-be Bishop Samuel Provost. Freeman and the church wardens wrote to Samuel Seabury, even sending him a copy of King's Chapel's new revised liturgy. When Seabury was visiting Boston, at one point he agreed to a meeting with Freeman. The meeting, of course, did not bode well for Freeman's chances towards ordination. He wrote of this encounter, quote, "My visit to Bishop Seabury terminated as I expected. Before I waited upon him, he gave out that he would never ordain me, but it was necessary to ask the question." Seabury agreed to ordain Freeman if and only if all Connecticut clergymen approved of his ordination. He did go to Connecticut to try to make his case, but his letters recount again that the meeting did not go well and can essentially be summed up with Freeman's admission at the time that, quote, "there are some parts of the Book of Common Prayer that I do not approve of." Freeman then met with Reverend Samuel Provost, who is in New York. He is pictured in the bottom right corner. While the church, King Chapel, was initially in agreement with Provost about King Chapel's revised liturgy, Provost was skeptical at the time about ordaining Freeman. Provost would bring up the question of ordination at the upcoming convention of American Episcopal leaders, but this wouldn't actually end up taking place until 1789. And as many of us probably know, that's several years after James Freeman was ultimately ordained within the church. But what we're looking at the screen here, for those who are interested, this is a letter from the senior warden, Thomas Bulfinch, who is pictured on the screen, to Samuel Provost on the topic of ordaining James Freeman and discussing the prayer book. After Freeman met with Provost, Freeman's outlook on ordination from the Episcopal bishop became less hopeful, but began to seriously consider lay ordination. After their meeting, Freeman wrote, quote, "Should Provost refuse to ordain me, I shall endeavor to effect a plan which I have long had in my head, which is to be ordained by the congregational ministers of this town, or to preach and administer the ordinances without any ordination. The last scheme I most approve of." The wardens did contact Provost again, but they reached no conclusion. And with all previous efforts essentially seemingly stuck in limbo, Freeman and King Chapel's wardens presented the lay ordination option to the congregation. In 1787, King Chapel charged forward in making history on their own terms by ordaining James Freeman without clergy present. Despite the hopeful conversations with Reverend Provost about ordination, the congregation of King's Chapel was unwilling to wait until the topic of his ordination would be discussed at this upcoming convention that again wouldn't be scheduled for several years. And despite the conversation that mentioned in Freeman's quotation about involving local clergy in the congregational tradition, rather than risk not being able to later be fully accepted into the Episcopal Church at a later point by incorporating clergy from another denomination in their ordination, King's Chapel opted again for this other route, lay ordination by vote. It was an idea the church discovered at the time was actually protected by the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution and the Declaration of Rights. This is an image of the Declaration of Rights from the 1780 Constitution. As put pretty clearly by Reverend Scoville, quote, "In defense of this mode of ordination, the ordaining committee appealed to scripture, the practice of the early church, and the Republican principles of the new nation." So the third article of the Massachusetts Constitution and Declaration of Rights offered the following protection of religious practice in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Quote, "The several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies shall at all times have the exclusive right of electing their public teachers and of contracting with them for their support and maintenance." So election was first utilized by King's Chapel at Freeman's ordination in 1787. And each ordination since has continued in this tradition of, quote, "by virtue of the Constitution and laws of this Commonwealth." So in October 1787, a committee of church members submitted a plan for ordination to the lay leaders of King's Chapel. And they recommended that the church, quote, "ordain, constitute, and appoint James Freeman to be their minister with full power to preach, baptize, administer the Holy Communion, bury the dead, and perform all the other rites and offices usually performed by a minister in Episcopal orders. Let this vote be entered upon the records of the church. Let it be read in public on some Sunday evening after divine service. let the members of the church publicly signify their assent to it, and let Mr. Freeman declare that he accepts of this ordination and appointment. So following a long defense of their reasons for opting to use lay ordination as opposed to established route, the leadership and congregation moved forward with these plans. And by the end of November, within a month of this statement, their vision finally came to fruition. In early November, the leadership determined a more precise plan for the ordination, conducted by the senior warden. They verified their intents with the members, and the ordination was scheduled for November 18th. Just a couple days earlier, however, several members of the church ended up submitting a protest expressing, quote, utter abhorrence of measures so contrary to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of an Episcopal church, representing a total alienation of the property of said house for the use intended by the original funders or donors. But of the 17 people who signed this petition, 5 had moved out of New England during the American Revolution, along with Reverend Cranmer, and 10 had not worshiped in the church for several years. So the senior wardens effectively determined that only 2 active congregants within the church had actually objected to the ordination. And despite these objections, the ordination went forward. So in a special service on Sunday, November 18th, 1787, conducted by Senior Warden Thomas Bulfinch II, who we have pictured here next to James Freeman, led the congregation in electing Freeman as their ordained minister. While the intention at the time, again, was not to break free as an independent church, Freeman's ordination ultimately sounded shockwaves through the local and Episcopal religious communities. In the immediate aftermath of James Freeman's lay ordination, King's Chapel received harsh criticism from area churches and from the Episcopal establishment. Despite King's Chapel's intentions, other churches viewed the ordination as a severing with any established church. Numerous newspaper articles covered the story, expressing shock, disappointment, and even satirical humor towards the church's actions. Soon, even the Episcopal establishment made their thoughts clear. King's Chapel had crossed a line and was not welcome in their communion. Within a month of the ordination, in early December 1787, just weeks, as I said, after the ordination, the local Episcopal clergy published the following protest, which you see on your screen, against King's Chapel, which they served or intended to effectively excommunicate King's Chapel and its members. So the part that I find kind of very interesting about this, which we talked about last week, but I'll read again here for those who weren't with us last time. They say, quote, "We, the ministers of the Protestant Episcopal Church, do hereby declare the proceedings of said congregation, usually meeting in the Stone Chapel in Boston, to be irregular, unconstitutional, diametrically opposite to every principle adopted in any Episcopal church, subversive to all order and regularity, and pregnant with consequences fatal to the interests of religion. And we do hereby, in this public manner, protest the aforesaid proceedings, to the end that all of those of our communion, forever dispersed, may be cautioned against receiving said reader or preacher, Mr. James Freeman, as a clergyman of our church, of holding communion with him as such, it may be induced to look upon his congregation in the light which it ought to be looked upon by all true Episcopalians." And among the signers of this document, of this protest, were the same Samuel Parker of Trinity Church, who was an early mentor to James Freeman, and also led the congregation of King's Chapel alongside his own after Cranmer's departure during the American Revolution. And we also see among the protesters, William Montague, who was the new minister at Christ Church, Boston, or the Old North Church. And of course, Trinity and Old North are daughter churches of King's Chapel. So there's interesting dynamic at play there. But over time, King's Chapel solidified its separation further in text, solidifying the church's view of a benevolent God, a positive outlook on humankind, and ultimately, as I said, removing the Apostles' Creed by the 1811 revision of the prayer book, and ultimately removing the last prayers for the Episcopal bishops in their prayer book that came out in 1828. Despite protests and controversy, Reverend Freeman, who we have pictured here both as a young man and in his later days, soon gained respect as an ordained minister among many churches in Boston. And his assistant ministers and successors would be involved in the broader American Unitarian Church and serve as editors and frequent contributors to the major Unitarian publications of the day. King's Chapel's theological revolution in the 1780s paved the path towards the growth and expansion of the Unitarian Church in America throughout the 19th century. The congregation James Freeman inspired in the 18th century remains committed to his memory. King's Chapel, of course, remains an active house of worship, home to a vibrant and thoughtful congregation of Unitarian Christians who to this day still worship each Sunday with a version of the liturgy first introduced to the church in the 1780s by James Freeman. Each prayer book in the chapel contains a copy of Freeman's original introduction expressing the church's, quote, earnest desire to live in brotherly love and peace with all men. A message as resonant in the years following the American Revolution as I think it is today. And the American Revolution and King's Chapel's theological revolution under Freeman's leadership go hand in hand and of course still influence, we can still see the influence experienced by them at King's Chapel today.